prior experience is not the same as prior performance. So experience and performance are not the same thing. I think companies tend to equate experience with performance. Just because someone has a lot of experience in the past doesn't mean that that experience equates to performance.
Welcome to the Tippie Leads podcast. Stories from the University of Iowa's Tippie College of Business that will change the way you work and lead. Produced by the Tippie Leadership Collaborative. I'm your host, Nick Westergaard. I teach at Tippie and lead our Story Lab program. This podcast provides another opportunity to share stories from Tippie with our community and beyond. Each season of Tippie Leads will focus on a grand challenge in today's changing world of work. This season, we're looking at engagement. When organizations hire new people, can they really predict if their employees will be successful and engaged? Most of the time, we look to one's previous experience as our gauge for predicting success and engagement at work. In our final episode of Season 1, we'll hear from Chad Van Iddekinge about why we overvalue experience in our new hires and what else organizations can do to predict new hire success. Later in the show, we'll hear a fun story about an on-the-job learning experience from Tippie undergrad Eric Jensen. And finally, we'll bring it all together with a final Tip E just for you. Ready? Let's get started. Chad Van Iddekinge is the Henry B. Tippie Research Professor of Management. Chad's research focuses on how organizations make staffing decisions and how those decisions affect job applicants and the quality and diversity of a firm's workforce. His research has been published in several leading journals, and he's been featured in outlets such as the Harvard Business Review, Bloomberg, and Glassdoor.com. Prior to his academic career, Chad spent several years working as a consultant. He continues to provide insights on selection and human resources to clients including the City of Chicago, the U.S. Census Bureau, the Department of Defense, and Yum Brands. So we've spent the entire season talking about employee engagement, and as we wrap things up, we've arrived at experience and job skills, which we often think of as an indicator of on-the-job performance. But when I read your research, Chad, I found my jaw actually dropping. Now, when jaws drop, it's often because something that we thought was true isn't. Case in point, your work on experience actually not predicting on-the-job success.
Yeah, so this was kind of an interesting study. We always hear about how important experience is, and when I teach undergraduates, they often lament their job search process involves applying for jobs, and the companies are always telling them you just need more experience, 3 to 5 years of experience, 5 to 10 years of experience, things like that. So we know companies really value this, and as kind of a proof of that concept, we pulled over 100 monster.com job ads and found that more than 80% of the ads mentioned either requiring or preferring experience, and even in jobs that were described as entry level, where you wouldn't think experience would be required or desired. So we have that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, when we look at research on experience, almost everything focuses on experience people gain within a particular company and how that affects how they perform or move up within the company. There's very little attention on what does experience in a different organization mean in terms of how people perform in a new organization. So there's a disconnect. On the one hand, organizations are screening job applicants on the amount or type of experience they have when applying for a job, but the research has focused more on experience people acquire once they're in the new job. So there was a disconnect there. So that's a little bit about the motivation of the study. And we just wanted to see to what extent does experience that applicants bring into a new job, into a new organization, does that translate into performing their job role and at what level? And we also looked at outcomes, including training performance, how people do in training, like new hire training, as well as retention. Does experience relate to how long people will stay within a company?
And the retention point I thought was fascinating also because it's both on the new hire pain point, but then ongoing as well. Say more about that impact.
Yeah, so just kind of the bottom line is we found that the pre-hire experience was not a strong predictor of how people perform in a new job, how they perform in training for that job, or how long they stay in that job or that organization. So it kind of, goes against what organizations are doing when they are screening applicants on the amount or type of experience they had. So obviously there's a disconnect here because typically organizations want to evaluate applicants on things that correlate with how they would do on the job and how long they would stay with the company. And if they don't, then that's not going to lead to very effective hiring outcomes for the company.
So, what did you find with regard to kind of a why behind that? Because you talk about the disconnect, and what we would think of as true feels like it would be true because you have people with experience at these jobs that aren't that. Why wouldn't they be able to outperform someone else?
Yeah, it's very intuitive to think that experience is helpful, and we're not saying that it's never helpful. Later, I'll maybe mention a couple situations where it seems like it's a little bit more helpful than others. And I should also say that we aren't able to directly address the why. Why experience isn't as valuable as organizations seem to think. But a couple things that we kind of speculate. One is that prior experience is not the same as prior performance. So experience and performance are not the same thing. And I think companies tend to equate experience with performance. And we can all think of people that we've worked with who have a lot of experience and have been in the same job and organization for a long period. And they're not the best performers, but they perform well enough to sort of, stay in that role and not be, let go and demoted and things like that. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind, that just because someone has a lot of experience in the past or certain types of experience doesn't mean that that experience equates to high levels of performance. In fact, some people, learn more from experience than other people do. And those are two concepts that are not the same thing. So I think that's one insight. And then there's also some theory that suggests that what people learn in previous jobs and organizations, kind of these scripts for how they go about accomplishing work, that those are pretty unique to each job and organization. And that those scripts or habits or ways of accomplishing work do not always translate into a different company that has different norms and ways of accomplishing things. Even in the same job, in two different organizations, that job could be quite different. If you think of a sales position in one organization to the other, yes, there's obviously similarities, but each organization is unique, has its own way of own products and services, values, customer base, lots of different factors. So our results are sort of in line with some of that theory that says that there's this, what you learn and do in one situation doesn't always carry over into a new situation because all jobs and organizations are unique to some extent.
So, when you talk about prior experience versus prior performance, is there, I mean, on the interview side of things, is there a different way of phrasing some of these questions that typically would be pretty straightforward, experience driven to tease out something that would be more relevant?
Yeah, and there's a lot recently written around the importance of skills, and that's one possibility. So instead of, and one thing too to note about a lot of the studies that we included in our meta-analysis is they measured experience in a pretty basic way, like, how many years of experience do you have in general? How many years of experience do you have in sales? How many different jobs have you had over the past 5 years? Do you have experience performing this particular task? So they were pretty basic questions that applicants answered. But if you try to, as you suggested, try to get at some of this stuff more like in an interview or a simulation of the job, where you can get at applicants' knowledge and skills that they may have obtained from those experiences, research suggests that those are going to be more valuable indicators of future performance than just the mere amount of experience applicants possess.
Your work also references things at the task level. And I think the difference between asking, you mentioned truck drivers, pilots, years versus hours logged doing something. Why does that difference matter?
Yeah, so we looked at the different types of experiences, and one way to think about that is how specific the experience is. So we could look at, hey, how many years of experience in different jobs do you have so the job level. We could look at how much experience in a particular role, such as sales, or we could try to dig down into the task level, such as the examples you mentioned. And there's not a lot of research here. We did a meta-analysis where we gathered all the studies that have looked at pre-hire experience and these outcomes and tried to come up with sort of the overall average. We had maybe like 10 studies that looked at the relationship between people's experience performing particular tasks. So we tried to identify the level at which the experience was measured, from just career experience, job experience, and then task experience was kind of at the lowest level. And there's some research that suggests that the more finer you can measure something, the more precise you can measure something, the more predictive it will be. And we did find some evidence of that when we looked at studies that measured experience with particular tasks within a job. Those did seem to translate a little bit better to how people perform those tasks in the new job. But when we looked at higher levels of experience, like at the job level, at the occupation level, at the level of general experience, then things seem to not be as strong.
So my ulterior motive here is trying to figure out, in talking about my own skills as a podcaster, do I say that I've been podcasting for 11 years, or do I say that with this 8th episode of Tippie Leads, I now have 633 podcast episodes under my belt? What is what's going to be more relevant for folks?
I can assure you are performing at a very high level.
All right.
Yeah, it's again, I think one of the takeaways here is it's really, there's always a struggle between assessing job applicants in a very cost-effective way that's not going to be too onerous on them and the organization. And so it's very easy to ask applicants to report in an application or in their resume how many jobs they've had, how many years of experience, do you have experience in this particular type of job. Those are easy things to collect. But I think a takeaway from our study is that if you really want to look at experience, and particularly how that translates into developing job relevant knowledge and skills, you're going to have to dig deeper. You're going to have to look at it within, as we talked about earlier, within a structured interview that really dials into the job relevant knowledge and skills people develop from experience, or some type of a work simulation that people can apply their knowledge and skills to perform something that similar to what they would do on the job.
Well, and you talk about it being, easy to screen for some of these very standard levels, but when we hear it framed from a shortage, a talent perspective, I mean, I think we've said disconnect so many times between us in this conversation, but companies really can't afford to just screen out some of these people based on black and white skills, experience that may not even predict success.
Yeah, and that's one of the kind of another main takeaway from our study from a practical perspective. Organizations may be screening out applicants who don't possess the certain type of experience or amount of experience they're looking for, but they could still perform the job quite well if given the opportunity. So I think there's definitely some unnecessarily reducing the applicant pool by screening on experience. And I think too, if you were to ask companies, how many years of experience do people really need to perform a particular job? They probably don't have the data to answer that question. So when you look at applications like we did as part of our study to see what our company's asking for, it's usually these very stock things like 2 to 3 years, 5 years. But if you were to go into those organizations and say, well, how did you come up with 3 years? Why not 6 years or 4 years or 1 year? I can promise you from working with companies over the years, they're not going to have a clue about why they selected that specific number. It's just always been there. It sounds good. So that's another challenge that we pose to companies is that anytime you screen in or screen out somebody, whether it's experience or whether it's whether they have a certain degree, or another common one is using some minimum GPA like 3.0. Anytime you screen out people or screen them in based on that, that is something that needs to be validated, needs to be looked at with great care, ideally having some evidence to support the use of that. But unfortunately, organizations just kind of do what they've always done and don't think carefully about those different points in the hiring process where they screen applicants in or out.
So as we close out our season here on Tippie Leads talking about employee engagement, what about, we've been talking about screening, about interviewing. How does experience at an organization as someone continues based on what you've found, how does that play out?
Well, there the research is a bit more supportive. Studies have consistently found that people, the longer they're in a job or organization, the better they tend to perform, at least up to some point. So there is definitely more support for experience people gain within the same organization that they're performing. Again, our study looked at experience in other jobs and organizations and how that translates into performance in a different organization. So there's definitely more support for internal experience and the importance of that. There too, though, experience is not the same thing as performance. So just because someone's been in the organization for 10 years, let's say, and you're looking at them for a promotion versus someone who only has a year of experience in the company, that person with 10 years of experience doesn't mean that they are going to be a better performer in this next role than the person who's only has 1 year of experience. You have to look at the knowledge and skills they possess, how they've performed in those roles, and how the role to which people may be applying for promotion, how similar is that to the role that people are currently in? And is there enough similarity to be able to say, well, they performed well in this role, therefore they should also perform well in the new role. Sometimes we reward people who have been with a company for a long period and we promote them into positions that really they don't possess the knowledge and skills for. So that's another thing to keep an eye on. In terms of situations when pre-hire experience seemed to be the most promising in our study, two things I would note. One is we found some evidence that pre-hire experience was a better predictor of how people performed when they first entered a new job in a new company. So we looked at how people performed in the first few months versus the first year versus 5 years out. And we did find that having more experience does help people perform better initially when they first come into a new company, but the value of that pre-hire experience seems to wane the longer they're in the organization. And then secondly, if you can measure experience at the task level and identify specific tasks or responsibilities that are really important to a particular job, gauging applicants' amount of experience performing those tasks seems to be a little bit more indicative of how they will do on the job than looking at these broader measures of pre-hire experience, like years of experience, number of jobs, and so on.
As Chad notes, there are some scenarios where experience is everything. Like, for example, driving a forklift. Eric Jensen is a Tippie undergrad, Story Lab participant, and peer mentor. At our Spring 2024 end-of-semester story showcase, Eric shared the following on-the-job story on the theme of growth.
One thing you all need to know about me is that I've always been a planner. When I was a kid, if my family was going to the zoo, I'd want to know what exhibits we'd be going to and in what order. If my friends wanted to go spend some time together, I'd want to know exactly what it is we'd be doing, where and what time, and if any of them just wanted to figure it out on the fly, that always irked me. I've never been a go-with-the-flow guy. So, take that, what you know about me, and let's jump into my first ever job at the age of 16. I started working at this small business landscape supply store called Patio Town. And at Patio Town, I started out by just loading landscape products by hand into customers' vehicles, like mulch bags or decorative rock. And after a few months of working there, my manager approached me one day and asked if I'd be interested in getting trained in on how to operate a forklift. And I was very intrigued by this because I viewed it as like I would be driving a go-kart for my job. And so, as you know about me, I took the training process very seriously, very diligently, and the day came where it was finally time for me to operate the forklift on the job. And I was tasked with taking a pallet full of patio pavers, elevating it, and sliding it into the bed of a pickup truck for a customer. And for those of you who have never driven a forklift, there's one thing you need to understand. The field of view is quite different than driving a car. So if a car, you have the wide open windshield in front of you, you can see practically everything. With the forklift, you have the rig itself that's in charge of elevating and de-elevating the forks. So that blocks some of your view. But when you factor in the fact that you're raising a whole pallet of pavers, it blocks pretty much your entire view. So it requires you to look out to the sides to make sure that you're lining yourself upright within the dimensions of the truck. And so I was easing on up to the truck, and I was so focused on lining myself upright because that was a core part of the training. So much to the point that I didn't even realize that my foot was neither on the gas pedal nor the brake pedal, and the forklift was just slowly creeping up. Next thing I know, I hear a loud crunch sound, and the suspensions of the truck contracted the other way. I immediately back out, to which I was met with a very angry customer yelling in my face, asking me things like, "You're just some kid, are you even capable of doing this? Are you stupid?" I glanced over, and a couple of my coworkers happened to be watching, and I met eyes with them, and they looked the other way with the yikes expression on their face. And in the moment, it was very humiliating for me because I had thought I was so well prepared, and yet I overlooked one small aspect because I was so focused on the other aspect, and I failed in the moment. So we had to get it settled with our manager, get the insurance claims and whatever, and after that I had no choice but to move on. And fortunately, I figured it all out. I never hit in our truck again with the forklift. But after several months of working with the forklift at that job, my manager approached me another day and asked if I'd be interested in working in the sales division of the business because a couple of the employees were moving on to other opportunities. And I was also intrigued by this because I was aspiring to major in business when I went to college. And I thought this could be a good introductory experience for me while I was in high school. And the components of this job is, managing the cash register, carrying out transactions, but showing customers around the store, helping them plan some projects, and of course answering the phone call for any customer inquiries. And it did not take me long working at Patio Town to realize that for me, the phone was a scarier workplace tool than the forklift. Because throughout middle school, going into high school, I almost exclusively communicated with people through text messages where I could plan out what I was going to say. or even I would schedule appointments through the click of a button on a website. And with the impromptu nature of phone calls, it's very uncomfortable for me. I have no idea what I'm going to be getting myself into, what's going to be asked of me. It's just against how I was hardwired growing up. So one of those instances, those first instances with my phone call, the phone rang and I looked around. I saw the manager of our store was already preoccupied with a customer. The other employees that were experienced were busy. And I realized it's going to be me answering this phone. So I pick it up and I go, "Patio Town, this is Eric." And to which I was met with what I could only assume was a veteran landscaping handyman who happened to be installing a retaining wall by himself in his backyard. And he was asking me some very technical questions like, how thick of a layer of class 5 gravel should I put beneath my retaining wall? Or how should I adhere the capstone to the top of my wall? And in the moment, I had to admit that I was not sure, and I'd have to go check with my manager. But in this instance, and in many others, I was met with a lot of dismay from the customers, asking me, well, why do you even work here if you don't know the answer to that question? And it was tough to take all these criticisms because I was, passionate about the job, but really it was just through trial and error that I learned some of the knowledge of the job. There's a quote I like that's pretty popular, and it goes, "A master has failed more times than the beginner has even tried." And I definitely learned that from this job because eventually I became good at answering those phone calls and helping out customers with whatever it was they're wondering about landscaping, but I did not get there right away. And so this job at Patio Town taught me that no matter how uncomfortable it may make me feel, there are going to be things in life that I cannot prepare for. And I'm going to have to make mistakes in order to learn. That's just simply how it's going to have to be. And so I grew up as a kid, always thinking that I could just start off in the shallow end of the swimming pool and ease my way in to get acclimated to the temperatures of the water and ease my way into the deep end. But what this job taught me is that really the best way to grow is just to cannonball into the deep end of the swimming pool and figure it out on the go, because that's what life is at the end of the day. Thank you.
Before we wrap up, let's go back to Chad Van Iddekinge one last time for a final tip E for you to remember in your work.
Yeah, for organizations, I hope that they take these results to heart, and instead of just coming up with some requirement about experience applicants must possess, to really think about the basis for that and to really scrutinize their application forms and what they're asking in online applications and in interviews, and really make sure that they're not screening people out unnecessarily. And so our study really challenges the relevance of pre-hire experience. There may be situations in which it's still relevant to some jobs and organizations, but we just implore organizations to really take a careful look at what they're requiring and to use data and evidence to support their use of pre-hire experience during the selection process.
This season on Tippie Leads, we've discussed strategies for staying engaged at work, including productivity tips from astronauts, structuring tasks, and Zoom meetings. We've learned how to infuse our work with meaning and how to find meaning outside of work through side hustles. We've also heard about things that diminish engagement, including hassles, frustrations, toxic bosses, and partner abuse, and how leaders can address these issues. Finally, in this episode, we've learned that experience doesn't necessarily predict if employees will be successful and engaged. As our first season comes to a close, I hope you've discovered some ideas and insights from Tippie that you can put into action to change the way you work and lead. This episode of Tippie Leads was written and produced by me, Nick Westergaard, and Steve Courtwright. Special thanks to Chad Van Iddekinge and Eric Jensen for sharing their stories. No forklifts were harmed during this production. We can't say the same thing for the customer's car. Tippie Leads is a production of the Tippie Leadership Collaborative. To learn more, go to tippie.uiowa.edu/Tippie Leads. If you liked this episode, share it with a friend or coworker. Or, better yet, subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you like to listen. And if you're feeling generous, consider leaving us a rating or review to help others find the show. This is Nick Westergaard signing off. On behalf of everyone at Tippie, thanks for listening, and go Hawks!